The Zeraki fled in the dead of night, their ships barely escaping the chaos below. Xeron 4, a Class 15 Deathworld, had broken them. The warnings they left behind echoed across the stars. No intelligent species could survive there. The planet was a living nightmare. Gravity that shifted without warning, winds that howled like tortured spirits, and storms that rained liquid fire. The soil itself could betray you, cracking open to reveal underground predators waiting with gaping maws. And yet, the Zeraki had once called it home. For centuries, they tried to tame it. They built domes, reinforced shelters, defenses, none of it mattered. Xeron 4 never let them rest. Their strongest warriors vanished in the jungles, their technology failed against the raw fury of nature. So they abandoned it, sealing their shame behind glowing hazard beacons. They told themselves no race could endure what they could not. And then, humans arrived. There was no caution in their approach, no fear in their landing. Where the Zeraki saw death, humans saw a challenge. The reports from orbit had them grinning like lunatics. A planet that actively tried to kill them? That just made things interesting. The moment the first team set foot on Xeron 4, they got to work. Gravity fluctuations? They adjusted their exosets and adapted. The acidic rain? Turned into a renewable energy source. The ever-shifting terrain? A perfect blueprint for something insane. It started as a joke, a half-mad remark from one of the engineers as a 100-mile-per-hour windstorm rattled their base. "This place is nuts. We should build a theme park." Nobody laughed. Instead, they started planning. The first ride was the proof of concept. They called it the Gravity Gauntlet. The track twisted through the mountains, designed to take full advantage of Xeron 4's unpredictable pull. Riders would feel their stomachs drop as the planet's gravity flickered, sending them into weightless freefall before slamming them into high-G turns. The result? A ride that no safety-conscious civilization would ever approve. But humans? Humans lined up by the thousands. It didn't stop there. Every natural hazard became an attraction. The storms that sent lightning bolts lashing across the sky? They wired conductive rails into them, creating Storm Rider, the first roller coaster to be powered by an active planetary storm. The carnivorous plants that had devoured Zeraki settlers? Bioscanners tracked them for the escape run, an interactive horror coaster where the plants were part of the experience. As word spread, the galaxy watched in stunned disbelief. Xeron 4 had been a world of despair, a graveyard of ambition. Now it had become a monument to human madness, a place where death itself had been repurposed into entertainment. And that was when the Zeraki returned. They arrived in force, expecting to find their cursed homeworld untouched, its dangers undisturbed. Instead, they found neon lights cutting through the eternal storm, the roar of coasters echoing over valleys where their ancestors had fought and died. The sight alone made their scales crawl. The Zeraki delegation stepped onto the planet they had once feared, staring in open horror as human tourists screamed in exhilaration, not terror. Their war-scarred elders watched as thrill-seekers strapped themselves into rides that defied physics, hurling themselves at speeds no Zeraki warship could match. And standing at the center of it all, grinning like a man who had conquered a god, was Marcus Vance, the architect of Deathworld Thrill Park. Commander Varkesh, leader of the delegation, stepped forward, barely concealing his disgust. "This was our home," he growled. "It devoured us. And you turned it into a playground?" Vance chuckled, watching another group of humans take off on the Gravity Gauntlet, their laughter lost in the rushing wind. "Yeah," he said. "And we're just getting started." Varkesh's claws flexed, his pride wounded. This was supposed to be impossible. This was supposed to be a world no species could conquer. And yet, the humans had done it. And worst of all, they were having fun. Varkesh could hardly believe what he was seeing. The place that had once swallowed Zeraki colonists whole was now a spectacle of flashing lights and roaring machinery. It was an insult. An impossibility. Yet here the human stood, thriving where his ancestors had failed. His warriors shifted uneasily, their tails flicking in agitation. This was supposed to be a wasteland, a graveyard of broken dreams. Instead, they watched as a group of humans strapped themselves into a towering metal structure that defied all logic. The track twisted through the jagged cliffs, disappearing into a storm-ravaged canyon before emerging in a near-vertical loop. The humans were laughing. Laughing. Varkesh turned his glare on the human responsible. You mock us. His voice was low, dangerous. This world was a curse upon my people, and you dare. Vance cut him off with a grin. We dared, he said simply. Varkesh's eyes narrowed. Your kind should not have survived here. Vance shrugged, motioning toward the park around them. We didn't just survive. We made it fun. Another group of riders launched into the sky on a rail system glowing with electrical discharge. The coaster surged through an active lightning storm, the energy arcing harmlessly around the protective shielding as passengers screamed, not in terror, but exhilaration. Varkesh recognized it immediately. The humans had tamed the very storms that had once torn Zeraki settlements apart. His warriors muttered among themselves, shifting uncomfortably. This was not what they had expected. They had come to reclaim a lost homeworld, a place of sorrow and tragedy. Instead, they found themselves standing in a monument to humanity's defiance. One of his officers spoke, his voice tinged with disbelief. You turned our suffering into entertainment? Vance folded his arms. We turned danger into a challenge. That's what we do. The Zeraki didn't understand. Couldn't understand. A death world was something to be feared, something to escape. To the humans, it was an opportunity. Where the Zeraki had seen endless struggle, the humans had seen potential. That was the true horror of it all. Not just that they had survived, but that they had enjoyed every second of it. Varkesh's tail flicked with barely contained frustration. You believe yourself superior because you mock danger? Vance's grin widened. Nah. We just don't let it stop us. The words were infuriating. Worse, they rang true. Varkesh had grown up hearing stories of Zerun 4, of the ancestors who had fought and died against a world that refused to be tamed. And yet, humans had come here and done the impossible. They hadn't conquered it through brute force or superior technology. They had embraced it. Varkesh exhaled sharply, his pride warring with reason. He wanted to dismiss this madness as foolish human arrogance. But the proof was all around him. The structure standing strong against the storms, the crowds lining up for thrills his people would never have dared face. The Zeraki had feared Zerun 4. Humans had made it their playground. And that meant only one thing. The Zeraki had something to prove. Varkesh's pride burned hotter than the storms crackling in the distance. His people had suffered here, fought and died, and now these humans strutted about as if they had beaten the planet itself. He refused to accept it. You claim to have mastered this world, he said, his voice sharp. But words mean nothing. If you have truly conquered Zerun 4, then prove it. Vance raised an eyebrow. Oh? Varkesh crossed his arms. Ride with us. Show us that this is not just a spectacle, that you are not simply playing pretend in a graveyard. A slow grin spread across Vance's face. You want a test ride? He gestured toward the towering coaster in the distance, its rails glowing as they absorb energy from the planet's volatile atmosphere. Then let's give you one. The Zeraki warriors hesitated. This was a death trap. Their instincts screamed at them to refuse, to turn away. And yet they had issued the challenge. Backing down now was unthinkable. They stepped forward. The humans wasted no time, strapping them in with an efficiency that unsettled the Zeraki. The contraptions clamped down around their chests, locking them into place. A mechanical voice began counting down. The track trembled beneath them. Then everything dropped. The gravity slammed into them like a warhammer. Their stomachs lurched as the coaster dove into a canyon, the air screaming past them. Zeraki claws scraped against the restraints as instinct took over, their bodies desperate to fight against the uncontrollable descent. It was a sensation beyond anything they had ever experienced, pure, unrelenting momentum. The next second, they were airborne. Gravity flickered, releasing them into a terrifying weightlessness. The sky stretched above them, the world falling away beneath them, and for a brief, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the track caught them again, and the force returned, twisting them into a loop at speeds that should have been impossible. They barely had time to process the shock before the coaster surged forward, straight into the storm. Lightning flashed. Energy crackled along the rails, illuminating the terrified faces of the Zeraki. Their bodies tensed, bracing for pain, for fire, for the devastation that had once torn through their colonies. But the humans had engineered this madness perfectly. The storm's fury was channeled, controlled, transformed into speed. And the humans? The humans were laughing. Vance, seated at the front, threw his hands up as the ride rocketed through the chaos, wind tearing at his clothes. He wasn't bracing. He wasn't panicking. He was enjoying it. The Zeraki had no words for what they felt. By the time the ride screeched to a stop, their bodies were trembling. The restraints unlocked, releasing them. None of them moved. Varkesh was the first to stand, though his legs were unsteady beneath him. His warriors followed, still processing what had just happened. Vance stretched, turning to face them. So? Varkesh opened his mouth, then closed it. He had prepared so many insults, so many arguments against this absurdity. But standing here, feeling the residual tremors of adrenaline in his limbs, he knew the truth. The humans had conquered this world. Not by brute force. Not by bending it to their will. But by embracing the chaos. By thriving in it. Finally, he exhaled. You humans are insane. Varkesh stood in stunned silence, his warriors just as shaken. Their bodies still trembled from the impossible ride, their hearts hammering in their chests. The weightlessness, the sudden drops, the sheer audacity of it all, none of it made sense. And yet, the humans had embraced it without hesitation, as if defying death was second nature. Vance clapped him on the back, grinning. So, what do you think? Still believe this world is unbeatable? Varkesh's jaw tightened. His entire life, he had been told that Zeran IV was unconquerable, that no civilization could ever withstand its relentless fury. And yet, here he was, standing in a place where humans had turned the very dangers that had once driven his people to despair into an attraction. His warriors exchanged uncertain glances. Some looked ready to protest, to cling to the old belief that this planet was nothing but a graveyard. But others, especially the younger ones, were staring at the coasters with something different in their eyes. Curiosity. A deep realization settled over Varkesh. This was more than just human madness. This was a fundamental difference between their species. The Zeraki had seen only suffering here. The humans had seen potential. He let out a slow breath. You have done what we could not. The words tasted bitter, but denying them would be foolish. You did not just survive. You thrived. Vance shrugged. It's what we do. Varkesh studied him, then turned his gaze back to the towering coasters, the flashing lights, the humans laughing as they willingly threw themselves into controlled chaos. What had once been a world of despair had become a beacon of human ingenuity. And deep down, he felt something he never expected. Envy. A Zeraki warrior hesitated before stepping forward. Commander, may we ride again? Varkesh turned to him in disbelief. The warrior straightened. I wish to understand. For a long moment, Varkesh said nothing. Then, to his own surprise, he found himself nodding. Then we shall. Vance grinned. Now that's the spirit. As the Zeraki warriors hesitantly stepped back into the loading area, the storm overhead rumbled. The planet had not changed. Zeran IV was still as violent, as dangerous, as untamed as ever. But for the first time in Zeraki history, they were no longer running from it. And that changed everything.